get ready to dim the lights and lock your doors. Friday Night Frights is here to haunt your weekend. Every Friday night, we bring you spine-chilling tales of the macabre, the mysterious, and the downright terrifying. From cursed artifacts to shadowy creatures lurking in the dark, these stories will keep you on the edge of your seat long after the episode ends. Are you brave enough to listen? Tune in and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more eerie episodes. Our story tonight is called The Last Hunt by Don Wulffson. So grab a cup of something yummy, sit back and relax, and enjoy the story. The forest hissed as the rain fell with a vengeance. It was a downpour, a deluge of huge, drifting curtains of water. Shivering, cursing his stubbornness and stupidity, Sean Robin stumbled through the blinding rain and the quagmire that had formed under his feet. His flannel shirt and blue jeans were plastered to his skin, and his high-top basketball shoes were soaked right through to his socks. His light blonde hair clung to his head like a sopping skullcap. His arms and hands were scraped raw from pushing low-hanging branches out of his way, and his body was covered from head to toe in mud and pine needles from all the falls he'd taken. "Where the heck am I?" he grumbled under his breath. For a moment he stopped and gazed around the darkening forest. "Great! It's almost nightfall, and I'm totally lost. For all I know, I'm walking in circles. I could freeze to death out here." Sean knew that he was probably no more than a few miles from the campsite. For almost a week, he and his dad had been backpacking through the mountains, and it had been a blast. But that afternoon, faced by a storm front moving in, they decided to stop hiking and pitch camp early. They'd played cards and read for a while, but Sean soon had become restless and had decided to go off and do a little exploring on his own. "Don't go too far," his dad had warned. "In fact, I want you back here in an hour. This storm front is moving in very fast." But Sean had been having too much fun, and the time had gotten away from him. Now, as he looked at his fogged-up watch, he saw that he'd been gone for over 4 hours. It was rapidly turning dark, and his dad was probably frantically looking for him. "If only I'd brought a compass," Sean scolded himself, "or at least worn a jacket so I wouldn't freeze to death. Maybe I—" Suddenly the wet sky lit up with a puzzle-work of lightning, and peals of thunder rumbled in the distance. His head down to shield his face from the wind and rain, Sean trudged on, while all at once an awesome spear of electricity socked into a towering tree just about 50 feet to his right. For a split second, Sean thought he was going to have a heart attack. Then, as his heart finally slowed back to normal, he stood and watched in stunned amazement as the tree lit up an array of reds, yellows, and oranges, like a huge Christmas tree decorated with lights. Then, without warning, the tree groaned as if it were in pain, and crawling with flames, it fell to the ground, taking another smaller tree down with it. In seconds, the burning trees filled the woods with the pungent scent of smoke, but the rain was pounding down so hard it soon doused the fire, leaving the trees looking like huge, blackened skeletons with wispy tendrils of steam rising from their branches and disappearing into the downpour. "Oh, man," Sean cried out, now shivering from both fear and the cold. "What am I going to do?" He was thinking of stopping, of building a shelter of some kind. "I can't just keep on like this forever," he was telling himself, when suddenly he thought he heard an odd snorting sound coming from behind him. Sean glanced around and for a moment stared in disbelief. Only a few yards away was the wet silhouette of a boar. Wild boars are killers, his mind screamed. There aren't supposed to be any in the United States, let alone up here in these mountains. Petrified with fear, Sean edged slowly away from the terrible beast. Then he ran with every bit of strength he could muster. As he propelled himself through the forest, sopping branches slapped him in the face and scratched his arms. The boar, he was sure, was right behind him, ready to pounce, ready to slash him with its tusks. But even though Sean knew it meant certain death to stop, he also knew he couldn't go on much longer. Finally, with his breath coming in painful gasps, Sean stopped and turned to face his enemy. There was nothing there but dark, dripping trees. Was it all just my imagination? Sean wondered as he continued to slog along. The way ahead became rocky and steep. He was scrambling upward when great tangles of lightning overhead lit up the surrounding area. Sean couldn't believe his eyes. Almost directly ahead was a large, rambling stone house. Must be my imagination again, he told himself. Lightning crackled again. Sean's disbelief vanished. Sure enough, there was a house right in front of him. Looks deserted, Sean thought, water streaming down his face as he clambered toward the place. But who cares? At least it will give me some shelter from the rain and cold. Approaching closer, Sean noticed that some of the windows glowed dully from inside. Somebody lives here, he thought to himself. I'm saved. A moment later, he was pounding on a heavy wooden door. It swung open, and a small man with tawny skin gazed up at him. Behind him was a second man, older, with white hair and a great, drooping, handlebar mustache. "Well, aren't you a sight?" the older man exclaimed. "Come in, my boy, come in." A half-hour later, Sean was wrapped in a soft blanket, soaking up the luxurious warmth coming from an oversized fireplace. His clothes were still a bit soggy, and his sodden shoes and socks were set out on the hearth to dry. All in all, he was in pretty good shape compared to how he'd been out in the storm. And yet Sean felt uneasy. The interior of the house was downright creepy. It looked like some sort of big, fancy, incredibly peculiar hunting lodge. Huge, oversized rifles and curious, ancient-looking pistols, swords, and spears were displayed on almost every wall, as were moose, elk, and deer heads. A hollowed-out elephant's foot held some old magazines. In an aquarium, a single hideous fish drifted, its mouth full of tiny pointed teeth and its lips endlessly smacking open and closed. Beside the aquarium, on a tiger-skin rug, sat a long-legged, oddly spotted dog, its unblinking yellow-brown eyes seemingly fixed on Sean. And overlooking all else, on a perch inside a mammoth cage, were two huge, grotesque birds that Sean was pretty sure were vultures. The menagerie of ugly creatures frightened him, as did the mounted animal heads and all the weapons. But what spooked Sean the most were the two men. After giving him a blanket and ushering him to a wicker chair by the fireplace, the white-haired elderly man had introduced himself as Conrad Montgomery. "And this is Abaya," Montgomery had said, turning toward the smaller man. "He's my, associate." Sean had told them his name and a little about how he'd gotten lost. "I don't think I'd have lasted much longer out there," he had added, expressing his appreciation for having been taken in. "Our pleasure, young man," Mr. Montgomery had said in a thick British accent. But Abaya, who remained silent, had just stood there stiffly and stared with unfathomable, remote-looking black eyes that seemed to bore right through Sean. "Would you care for a bit of cocoa and cookies, lad?" Montgomery had asked. When Sean had responded with an enthusiastic, "I'd love some," the two men had disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Sean with a bizarre menagerie of animals as his only company. That had been at least 20 minutes ago. How long does it take to make cocoa? Sean wondered. What the heck are they doing? Did they forget me out here? Then he thought about his dad. He's worried sick, I'm sure, and he's probably out looking for me. Somehow I've got to get back to him, but it's dark and freezing out, and I don't even know where I am. Interrupting his thoughts, one of the huge vulture-like birds squawked as Montgomery appeared and put a plate full of homemade cookies on a little antique table near the enormous fireplace. "Sorry to have taken so long," the mustached man said pleasantly, sitting down in a zebra-skin chair across from Sean. "We rarely have visitors, so we didn't seem to have a thing in the house. Abaya made us a little Burmese treat from scratch." He gestured toward the cookies. "Thank you," said Sean. "I didn't mean to put you to so much trouble." "Oh, no trouble at all," said Montgomery with a smile. Suddenly a shadow loomed behind Sean. His nerves on edge, the boy abruptly turned to see Abaya set down 2 mugs of cocoa. Then the little man, limping a bit, made his way over to a window and peeked out. "It appears that the rain has all but stopped," he said in a tiny, lilting voice. With a dramatic flourish, he drew the curtains back and grinned oddly. Sean was a little startled. These were the first words he'd heard Abaya speak. "Help yourself, boy," Montgomery said, gesturing toward the cocoa and cookies. With a wave of his hand, he, too, was sporting an odd grin. A bit hesitantly, Sean took a sip of cocoa, then tried one of the cookies. It was delicious and tasted of cinnamon, and the cocoa was rich and extra sweet. Relaxing a bit, Sean asked Montgomery a few questions about his home. "You sure have a lot of, interesting stuff, sir," he said as his eyes roamed around the room, traveling over the walls and the various cages, tanks, and suitcases. "And I've never seen so many different kinds of animals." He stopped for a moment. "Or weapons." "I've hunted all my life, boy, and I've traveled all over the world," Montgomery told Sean with great gusto. "All over, I tell you." With obvious pride, he then walked around the room and pointed out some of his favorite trophies: the heads of a rare albino moose from Canada, a bull elephant from Africa, a panther from India, and a grizzly bear from the Colorado Rockies. "And how about that?" he said, gesturing toward the far wall, an expansive space that bore the entire bodies of several animals, including a tiny Persian deer, a Congolese crocodile, an Australian wombat, and an East Asian cobra. "Wow!" Sean gasped. Montgomery next introduced a few of the animals in his live collection. These were clearly his most prized possessions. "I'm sure you thought this spotted fellow here was just an odd-looking dog," Montgomery said with a laugh, "but he's actually a very tame hyena. Those birds in the cage, I'm sure you've already guessed, are vultures, and that fish is a voracious little beast called a piranha." The man then heaved a heavy sigh. "I do wish Elsa were here to show you," he said. "Elsa?" Sean asked, afraid to know what kind of man-eating creature she might be. "She's my dear little wild boar who escaped from her pen a few days ago," Montgomery laughed. "Elsa's always getting out. She's old and all but harmless, though." He shook his head. "I suppose when this rain lets up, Abaya and I will have to go track her down again." So I didn't imagine that boar in the forest, Sean thought. Then, relaxing a bit, he sat back and began to enjoy Montgomery's stories. "Hunting is such an exhilarating sport," Montgomery said, "but I have found that killing creatures is no sport compared to collecting live specimens." "Do you still hunt, sir?" Sean asked. "Abaya and I are more or less retired now." Montgomery smiled at Sean, then at Abaya, as the man took a seat near the aquarium. "No, our hunting days are pretty much over, I'm afraid." "You've hunted all over the world?" Sean asked. "And I guess just about everything there is to hunt." "Indeed." "What was your most exciting hunting trip?" asked Sean, genuinely interested. "My last," answered Montgomery without hesitation. He leaned forward in the flickering light of the fireplace. "Would you care to hear about it? I warn you, you might find it rather terrifying." Sean nodded, a chill going up his spine. Sure, I like to be terrified," Sean quipped nervously. Montgomery leaned back. "It happened many years ago," he began, his face masked in shadow, "but it seems like yesterday." He paused for a moment as if thinking back and deciding how to begin. "I was on a hunting trip that took me to a Lahu village high in the mountains on the Thai-Burma border. The Lahu, a people of Burma, are great hunters and fearless, but as I was set to go on a hunt one night, a Lahu man raised his hand and said, 'Ta is close to this village. We can no go hunt now.' My Burmese guide explained to me and the others in my hunting party that a Ta is what America and Britain call a werewolf. As you may know, when it is in wolf form, it will attack, and sometimes eat people, and a bite from one can turn the victim into a werewolf. Also, if a werewolf is wounded or killed while in its wolf form, when it changes back into a human, it will likewise be injured or dead." "Yes, I've heard most of that, Mr. Montgomery," Sean gulped. "But you're not saying that you actually killed one, and that—" The old hunter raised his hand for silence. "Let me explain," he said, then continued with his story. "It was while I was thus engaged in conversation with my Burmese friends that a shriek cut through the night. It came from a thatched hut near the jungle's edge. My hand flew to my pistol, and I dashed toward the source of the scream. My Burmese guide and the others slowly followed behind me, and I heard them muttering, 'Ta!' I slowed as I approached the hut from which the scream had come. On tiptoe I made my way up to the only window, and peering inside, gazed upon a sight I shall never forget to my dying day. Within that hut, chewing on the slashed neck of a now dying woman, was a huge creature covered with coarse hair." "It was a werewolf!" Sean exclaimed. "Yes," the old man said, "and I must admit I was paralyzed with fear. The beast looked right at me with its beady red eyes, its bloody fangs glistening in the moonlight." "Did it attack you?" Sean's eyes were wide, and his skin was crawling with goosebumps. Montgomery nodded. "Yes. It leaped right for my throat, and as it did I fired wildly with my pistol. I knew I had wounded it, for it let out a shrieking howl as it ran off into the night." "Did you go after the werewolf? I mean, the Ta?" Sean asked. "Of course I did. After covering up the corpse of the woman, I grabbed a rifle and headed into the jungle in search of the beast." "You went after it alone?" Montgomery shook his head no. Though the others in the hunting party were too frightened to go, my courageous Burmese guide stayed right at my side. Montgomery's gaze drifted in the direction of Abaya. Sean glanced over his shoulder to where the little man sat in shadows, realizing that Abaya was undoubtedly the courageous Burmese guide to whom Montgomery was referring. The elderly Englishman leaned closer. His hands were on his knees, and in the ghostly light from the fire, Sean could see that the backs of them were deeply scarred. "We found no trace of the taa that night," said Montgomery, continuing his story. "But the next morning my guide and I began a fresh search, and with the help of daylight we discovered a trail of blood-stains that led from the hut into the surrounding thicket. We tracked the stains as we circled the village, only to re-enter at the opposite end." "The werewolf had come back!" Sean exclaimed. Montgomery nodded. "The blood splotches led into another hut. We dashed inside, our weapons drawn, and found a man lying on the bed, clearly bleeding to death. His eyes were open and glazed, and he was bleeding from a bullet hole in his leg, just below the hip." "It is the taa," said my guide, his voice filled with hatred and loathing. "But this is not the creature I saw ripping at the woman's throat last night. This is a man," I protested. My guide stepped closer and spat right in the near-dead face. "Taa!" he hissed. For a long moment an eerie silence settled over the room. Spellbound, Sean gazed at Montgomery. "So the man in the bed was the werewolf you shot the night before?" Sean said. "He was bleeding to death, and you just let him die, right?" "No, we saved him, didn't we, Abaya?" replied Montgomery. "We stopped the bleeding." "But why save a werewolf?" Sean asked. "It appears you have forgotten what I said earlier." Montgomery smiled. "Killing an exotic creature is less exciting than taking a live specimen." Sean's skin began to crawl. His eyes were fixed on the scars on the old man's hands. A numbing thought crept into his head. If Montgomery had been bitten by the werewolf, then he— "What's wrong, boy?" Montgomery raised an eyebrow. Did you get bitten by the taa?" Sean asked, every muscle in his body tense, ready to leap up and run. "No, my dear boy," laughed Montgomery. He smiled generously. "However, there is something else you are not clear about." "What's that?" "My brave Burmese guide who stayed with me." Montgomery's words trailed off, and he left the sentence incomplete. He looked at Abaya, who had gotten up and was limping past the vulture's cage toward him. This courageous man I mentioned earlier was named Hamar, not Abaya. "Then who is Abaya?" His heart racing, Sean began to woodenly turn his head. Montgomery laughed darkly. "The man I nursed back to health, who had been shot in the leg." Sean's eyes opened wide in horror as his gaze came to rest on Abaya. As the little man limped into the light from the fire, his features began contorting. The pores of his skin sprouted black, slimy-looking hair. Claws curled out from his hands, and his teeth changed into sharp, knife-like fangs. "Meet the most exotic creature in my collection," trumpeted Montgomery. "A taa." Sean screamed as the beast, its eyes gleaming red, moved toward him in a crouch. Just as the taa sprang, Sean twisted sideways, then slammed full force into Montgomery, sending the man sprawling. The aquarium went over with a watery crash. "Get him!" Montgomery bellowed. The vultures shrieked and the hyena laughed as Sean bolted from the place, the taa close behind. Running for his life, he had almost reached the woods when he felt the beast's claws slash his back. He shrieked in pain, stumbled, then went down face first into the mud. "No!" Sean screamed, and then the taw sank its fangs into his throat. There was a moment of intense pain, then all went dark before his eyes as he slipped into unconsciousness. Of the grisly feast that followed, he knew nothing. Late the following afternoon, a tired, worried-looking man rapped on the door of what looked like a large hunting lodge out in the middle of the forest. "Sorry to bother you," the man said to the two men who answered the door, an elderly gentleman and a small, younger-looking man. "My name is Charles Robbins. Yesterday my son Sean got lost somewhere in these woods. I've been looking for him all night. Have you seen a teenage boy who's about 5 feet 8 inches tall and has sandy blonde—" "No, I can't say that I have," interrupted the older man with a smile. He turned to his companion. "How about you, Abaya? Have you seen any children in these woods?" The little man shook his head. "But please do come in," the elderly man said with a smile, opening the door wide. "I am Conrad Montgomery," he said, shaking hands, "and this is my good friend Abaya. Perhaps we can be of assistance, or at least offer you a bit of refreshment." "Thank you," said Charles Robbins, stepping warily into the room, mopping sweat from his brow. "I'm sure Sean will turn up. He's a resourceful boy, but I'm still very worried. That was quite a storm we had last night." "It was indeed," said Montgomery, glancing at Abaya's distended belly as he shut the door. He gestured toward an easy chair. "Please have a seat and chat with us." He sighed. "Living alone like this, we rarely have visitors. We just love to have people stop by, don't we, Abaya?" "Yes," said the little man. He grinned broadly. "It is always a real treat." Thank you for listening to this week's story, and I hope you'll join us next week as we bring you more great classic tales on Friday Night Frights. And until then, have a great week, everyone.